Most people believe that criminal investigations follow evidence wherever it leads, and that justice applies equally regardless of someone's social connections. What if I told you that the most powerful protection against legal consequences isn't money or lawyers, but simply knowing the right people in the right positions? This seems impossible because we constantly hear about high-profile arrests and see wealthy individuals facing charges in the news. But there's something that doesn't quite add up here. We see federal investigations that start with great fanfare and media attention, then quietly disappear from public view without clear explanations. Why do some cases involving powerful networks suddenly lose momentum while isolated individuals face the full weight of the justice system? Could it be that professional relationships create invisible barriers that redirect investigations away from certain circles? The network immunity system operates by converting individual criminal liability into collective institutional protection through strategic relationship management and information control. Isolated individuals face prosecution as lone actors whose crimes reflect personal moral failings. Connected individuals benefit from coordinated defense strategies that distribute responsibility across multiple institutions while emphasizing systemic complexities rather than individual accountability. When we examine how federal investigations actually develop and resolve, the manipulation becomes impossible to ignore through documented patterns of selective enforcement. If this kind of systematic relationship-based immunity designed to protect elite networks interests you, subscribe to Prof. Jung Explained and share this video with someone who's wondered why certain high-profile cases seem to vanish despite initial evidence. They need to see how professional connections function as legal shields. The protection mechanism starts with information compartmentalization, long before any criminal charges emerge. Powerful networks typically involve multiple overlapping professional relationships across government, finance, academia, and media sectors. When potential criminal activity surfaces within these networks, information gets managed through established channels rather than flowing directly to law enforcement. Network members often learn about developing situations through informal communications that allow for coordinated response strategies before formal investigations begin. Isolated individuals typically learn about investigations when law enforcement arrives at their door, providing no opportunity for strategic preparation or coordinated defense planning. Financial institutions play crucial roles in network immunity through their compliance and reporting relationships with federal agencies. Banks that serve high net worth clients often maintain ongoing communications with regulatory bodies about unusual transaction patterns or suspicious activities. These communications create opportunities for contextualization and explanation that individual account holders rarely receive. When network-connected individuals engage in questionable financial activities, their institutions typically provide detailed explanations about legitimate business purposes and complex international arrangements. When isolated individuals engage in similar activities, they often face immediate account closures and suspicious activity reports that trigger law enforcement attention. Legal representation creates another layer of network immunity through coordinated defense strategies that sophisticated criminal networks can afford, but individual defendants cannot access. High-end criminal defense involves teams of attorneys who specialize in different aspects of complex cases and maintain relationships with former prosecutors and federal judges. These legal teams often include former federal prosecutors who understand how investigative priorities get established and how resources get allocated within federal agencies. They can provide strategic guidance about timing, cooperation agreements, and plea negotiations that reflects insider knowledge of how the system actually operates. Individual defendants typically rely on single attorneys or small firms that lack the resources and relationships necessary to navigate complex federal investigations effectively. They often face pressure to accept plea agreements quickly rather than mounting sophisticated defense strategies that could take years to develop and implement. But here's where the system becomes particularly sophisticated. Network immunity doesn't just protect individuals from prosecution. It actually redirects investigative focus toward peripheral figures while insulating core network members from scrutiny. Federal investigations often begin with lower-level participants who lack the resources and connections necessary to mount effective defenses. These individuals face significant pressure to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity agreements. However, network-connected investigations typically involve cooperation agreements that focus on technical violations or financial irregularities, rather than the most serious underlying crimes. Cooperating witnesses often provide information about procedural matters and administrative failures, rather than substantive criminal conduct by high-level network members. The media management aspect of network immunity creates public narratives that emphasize complexity and ambiguity rather than clear criminal accountability. Network-connected cases typically receive coverage that focuses on regulatory failures, institutional oversight problems, and systemic issues that require comprehensive reform rather than individual prosecution. Individual criminal cases typically receive coverage that emphasizes personal responsibility, moral failure, and the importance of deterrent punishment. The same underlying criminal behaviors get framed differently based on whether they occur within protected networks or involve isolated actors. Consider how financial crimes get investigated and prosecuted differently depending on the professional relationships involved. Individual defendants who engage in fraud or money laundering typically face charges that emphasize the criminal nature of their conduct and the harm caused to victims. Network-connected financial crimes often get characterized as regulatory violations or compliance failures that reflect inadequate institutional controls rather than intentional criminal conduct. The same behaviors that will result in decades-long prison sentences for individual defendants often result in civil penalties and deferred prosecution agreements for network-connected cases. The timing and sequencing of network-connected investigations also reveals the protective mechanisms at work. Federal agencies typically coordinate with multiple institutions when investigating network-connected cases, creating opportunities for strategic delay in information management that individual defendants cannot access. These investigations often involve extended periods of informal discussions and negotiations between defense attorneys and federal prosecutors before any formal charges emerge. The extended timeline allows network members to prepare coordinated responses and implement damage control strategies that isolated defendants cannot develop. Professional relationships between defense attorneys and federal prosecutors create additional layers of network immunity through informal communications and strategic considerations that extend beyond individual cases. Former federal prosecutors who represent network-connected defendants often maintain personal and professional relationships with current federal officials that influence how cases get handled. These relationships don't necessarily involve explicit corruption or improper influence. Instead, they create shared understanding about prosecutorial priorities, resource constraints, and strategic considerations that affect how investigations develop and resolve. The regulatory capture phenomenon extends network immunity beyond criminal justice into administrative and civil enforcement realms. Federal agencies that regulate industries often develop ongoing relationships with the institutions and professionals they oversee, creating informational and operational dependencies that affect enforcement decisions. When network-connected violations occur, regulatory agencies typically work with violating institutions to develop compliance programs and remediation strategies rather than pursuing maximum penalties. The emphasis falls on institutional reform and future compliance rather than punishment for past violations. Individual violators typically face administrative penalties and enforcement actions that emphasize deterrent effects and rule of law principles. They rarely receive opportunities to negotiate comprehensive remediation agreements or participate in extended compliance planning processes. The international dimension of network immunity creates additional protection through jurisdictional complexity and diplomatic considerations that federal agencies must navigate when investigating cross-border criminal activity. Network-connected cases often involve multiple countries and international institutions that require coordination and cooperation between various law enforcement and regulatory agencies. These international complexities create opportunities for strategic delay and procedural complications that can significantly reduce the likelihood of successful prosecution. Network-connected defendants often have access to legal and political resources in multiple jurisdictions that allow them to create procedural barriers and jurisdictional conflicts. Individual defendants who engage in international criminal activity typically lack the resources and connections necessary to navigate multi-jurisdictional legal processes effectively. They often face streamlined extradition procedures and coordinated international law enforcement efforts that individual defense attorneys cannot counter effectively. The congressional oversight dimension of network immunity operates through relationships between network members and elected officials who control federal agency budgets and oversight responsibilities. High-profile investigations involving network-connected individuals often attract congressional attention that can influence prosecutorial priorities and resource allocation. Congressional oversight can create protective effects through public hearings and investigations that focus on systemic reform rather than individual accountability. The political attention often results in institutional changes and policy reforms rather than criminal prosecutions of network members. Network immunity also operates through what might be called prosecutorial economics. Federal prosecutors face resource constraints and performance pressures that affect how they prioritize cases and allocate investigative resources. Complex network-connected cases often require years of investigation and substantial resources without guaranteeing successful prosecution outcomes. Individual cases typically offer clearer paths to conviction with lower resource requirements and higher success probabilities. Prosecutors face career incentives that favor pursuing cases they can win decisively rather than complex cases that might end in acquittals or hung juries. The network immunity system ultimately works because it converts criminal liability from individual accountability into institutional risk management. Network members don't avoid consequences entirely, but they transform criminal consequences into regulatory compliance costs and reputational management challenges. Individual defendants face personal consequences that include imprisonment, permanent criminal records, and social stigma that affects their entire lives. Network-connected defendants typically face institutional consequences that get distributed across organizations and resolved through financial penalties and operational changes. The institutional protection mechanism becomes particularly sophisticated through what economists might call liability distribution. When network-connected criminal activity gets discovered, the legal response typically focuses on organizational failures and systemic weaknesses rather than individual criminal intent and personal responsibility. This approach allows network members to accept responsibility for institutional shortcomings while avoiding personal criminal liability for specific criminal acts. They often acknowledge compliance failures and management oversights without admitting to intentional criminal conduct that would result in personal imprisonment. Individual defendants rarely have access to liability distribution strategies because they lack the institutional affiliations necessary to separate personal conduct from organizational context. Their criminal activities typically get characterized as personal moral failures that reflect individual character defects rather than institutional system failures. The system perpetuates itself because network immunity creates powerful incentives for maintaining professional relationships and institutional loyalties that provide protection against legal consequences. Individuals who benefit from network immunity typically do so by demonstrating value to other network members through information, access, or specialized expertise. The protection operates bidirectionally, creating mutual dependencies that strengthen over time. Network members protect each other not through explicit agreements or coordination, but through shared understanding about mutual vulnerabilities and collective interests in maintaining system stability. These mutual protection arrangements often develop gradually through routine professional interactions rather than explicit criminal conspiracies. Network members learn to coordinate their responses to potential legal threats through informal communications and shared legal strategies that don't require explicit coordination or criminal agreement. The informal coordination becomes particularly effective because it operates through legitimate professional relationships that prosecutors cannot easily characterize as criminal conspiracy. The communications often involve discussions of regulatory compliance, business strategy, and legal risk management that appear entirely legitimate when examined individually. However, the cumulative effect of these communications creates coordinated resistance to law enforcement investigations that individual defendants cannot replicate. Network members typically receive advance warning about developing investigations through multiple channels that allow them to prepare defensive strategies before formal legal proceedings begin. The advance warning system operates through professional networks that include attorneys, consultants, financial advisors, and institutional relationships that span multiple sectors. When law enforcement begins investigating network-connected activity, information about the investigation typically spreads through these professional channels faster than official legal processes can develop. Individual defendants rarely receive comparable advance warning because they lack the professional relationships necessary to access informal information networks. They typically learn about investigations through formal legal processes such as search warrants, subpoenas, or arrest warrants that provide no opportunity for advanced preparation. The information advantage creates fundamentally different relationships with law enforcement for network-connected versus individual defendants. Network members often engage with investigators through attorneys who maintain ongoing relationships with law enforcement officials and understand how to manage information flow strategically. Individual defendants typically encounter law enforcement through adversarial processes that emphasize criminal consequences and punishment rather than information management and strategic cooperation. They rarely have access to attorneys who can negotiate informal cooperation agreements or strategic information sharing arrangements. The cooperation agreement dimension of network immunity creates additional layers of protection through selective information sharing that benefits network members while exposing peripheral participants to legal consequences. Federal investigations often rely on cooperation agreements with lower-level participants to develop cases against higher-level targets. However, network-connected investigations typically involve cooperation agreements that focus on procedural violations and administrative failures rather than substantive criminal conduct by core network members. Cooperating witnesses often provide information that supports regulatory enforcement actions rather than criminal prosecutions of key network participants. The regulatory enforcement focus serves network interests because regulatory violations typically result in financial penalties and compliance agreements rather than criminal prosecution, and imprisonment. Network members can often absorb regulatory costs as business expenses while avoiding the personal consequences associated with criminal conviction. Individual defendants who cooperate with federal investigations typically face pressure to provide information about substantive criminal conduct that can support criminal prosecutions of other participants. Their cooperation agreements often require them to admit personal criminal responsibility and provide detailed testimony about specific criminal acts by other individuals. The testimony requirements create different legal risks for cooperating witnesses depending on their position within protective networks. Network-connected cooperating witnesses often provide information about institutional failures and procedural violations that don't implicate specific individuals in criminal conduct. Individual cooperating witnesses typically provide information about specific criminal acts by identifiable individuals, making them vulnerable to retaliation and legal consequences if their cooperation becomes public. They rarely have access to institutional protection or legal resources that could shield them from the consequences of cooperation. The public relations dimension of network immunity operates through sophisticated media management strategies that shape public perception of criminal investigations and their outcomes. Network-connected cases typically receive coverage that emphasizes complexity, ambiguity, and institutional failure rather than individual criminal responsibility. The media management often involves coordinated messaging across multiple institutions and professional relationships that can influence how journalists and editors approach coverage of sensitive investigations. Network members typically have access to public relations professionals and media consultants who specialize in managing crisis communications during federal investigations. These public relations resources allow network members to shape public narratives about their involvement in criminal activity before formal charges emerge. They can provide alternative explanations for suspicious conduct and emphasize their cooperation with law enforcement rather than their potential criminal liability. Individual defendants rarely have access to sophisticated public relations resources that could help them manage public perception during criminal investigations. Their cases typically receive coverage that emphasizes the criminal nature of their conduct and the importance of deterrent punishment for similar crimes. The coverage differential creates additional pressures on individual defendants to accept plea agreements quickly rather than fighting charges that receive negative media attention. Network-connected defendants often benefit from media coverage that creates public sympathy and support for their position rather than demands for harsh punishment. The international dimension of network immunity creates protection through jurisdictional complexity and diplomatic considerations that federal agencies must navigate. Network-connected cases often involve multiple countries requiring coordination between various law enforcement agencies, creating opportunities for strategic delay and procedural complications. Individual defendants typically face streamlined processes without access to resources that could create jurisdictional barriers. They rarely benefit from diplomatic considerations that might affect prosecution decisions involving network members with international connections. When you examine high-profile cases that seem to disappear despite initial evidence and media attention, do you see individual prosecution decisions or systematic relationship management? The answer reveals whether justice follows evidence or follows networks. The question becomes more complex when you realize that network immunity doesn't necessarily require corruption or conspiracy. It operates through legitimate professional relationships and institutional processes that create differential treatment based on social capital rather than explicit criminal coordination. This creates situations where identical criminal behaviors result in completely different legal outcomes based solely on the defendant's position within professional networks rather than the severity of their conduct or the strength of the evidence against them. The network immunity game succeeds because it convinces the public that complex investigations require institutional solutions rather than individual accountability, while providing network members with practical tools for converting criminal liability into manageable business risks. Subscribe to Prof. Jang Explained for more analysis of how institutional systems serve different purposes for different social classes, and share this video with someone who might be ready to question whether justice follows evidence or follows networks in high-stakes federal investigations.